The early morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of Linda's Corner Cafe, casting long shadows across the checkered floor tiles. Harold Myers, a 93-year-old veteran with silver hair and kind blue eyes, pushed open the heavy glass door at exactly 7:15 a.m., just as he had done every Thursday for the past 12 years. A small bell above the door announced his arrival with a gentle chime. "Good morning, Mr. Myers," called out Jenny, the young waitress with freckles scattered across her nose. She was already holding his usual cup of black coffee and moving toward his favorite spot, the corner window booth that gave him a perfect view of Main Street. Harold's wrinkled face brightened with a warm smile as he carefully made his way to his seat, his wooden cane tapping softly against the floor. "Morning, Jenny," he replied, easing himself into the familiar red vinyl booth. "And please, I told you 100 times to call me Harold." His hands, though weathered by time, were steady as he accepted the steaming coffee cup. The cafe had become Harold's second home since his wife Sarah passed away 5 years ago. The quiet mornings helped him maintain a sense of routine, and watching the town come to life reminded him that the world kept turning, even when his own had stopped for a while after losing Sarah. Jenny placed a menu in front of him, though they both knew he would order the same thing. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon. "Just in case you want to try something new today," she said with a playful wink. It was part of their Thursday morning ritual. As Harold sipped his coffee, his eyes wandered to the old photographs hanging on the cafe's walls. Black and white images showed the town's history, the main street during the 1940s, the old movie theater that had burned down in '62, and even a younger version of himself standing proudly next to his motorcycle repair shop. That photograph always brought back a flood of memories. The morning crowd started filtering in: Mr. Johnson from the hardware store, Mrs. Peters, who taught at the elementary school, and the usual group of retirees who gathered to discuss everything from politics to baseball scores. Each person who passed Harold's booth offered a greeting or a friendly nod. He was something of a living landmark in their small town. Harold was halfway through his breakfast when the peaceful atmosphere of Linda's Corner Cafe changed dramatically. The rumble of motorcycle engines grew louder as several bikes pulled into the parking lot. Through the window, he counted 6 motorcycles, their chrome surfaces gleaming in the morning sun. The riders dismounted their bikes with an air of ownership, their leather jackets decorated with patches and studs. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, pushed the cafe door open with such force that the bell nearly flew off its mount. Jenny's usual cheerful expression faltered slightly as the group of bikers filled the entrance. The other customers grew quiet, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Harold continued eating his eggs, though his grip on his fork tightened ever so slightly. "Nice place you got here," the bearded man announced loudly, his eyes scanning the cafe before settling on Harold's corner. A smirk crossed his face as he nudged one of his companions. "Look at that, boys. We got ourselves a prime spot right by the window." The group of bikers made their way toward Harold's booth, their heavy boots echoing against the floor. The leader stopped directly beside Harold's table, casting a shadow over his breakfast. "Hey, old-timer," he said, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "How about sharing some real estate with the next generation?" Harold looked up slowly, meeting the biker's gaze with eyes that had seen far more challenging situations than this. For a moment, the cafe was completely silent. Jenny stood frozen behind the counter, coffee pot suspended in midair. The other customers watched with a mixture of concern and curiosity. What happened next would become the talk of the town for months to come, but at that moment, no one could have predicted how this confrontation between a 93-year-old veteran and a group of intimidating bikers would unfold. Harold's response would not only surprise everyone in Linda's Corner Cafe that morning, but would also mark the beginning of an extraordinary story that would change both his life and the lives of these unexpected visitors. Harold's peaceful mornings at Linda's Corner Cafe became a thing of the past. Every Thursday, like clockwork, Spike and his motorcycle gang would arrive just as Harold was settling into his breakfast routine. The once quiet cafe now echoed with loud laughter, rough language, and the constant scraping of chairs against the floor as the bikers made their presence known. Jenny, who had always taken pride in providing excellent service to everyone, found herself caught in an uncomfortable situation. She watched helplessly as the bikers deliberately bumped Harold's table while walking past, causing his coffee to spill onto his newspaper. They would snicker when he had to use his trembling hands to clean up the mess. "Oops, sorry, old-timer," Spike would say with fake concern, earning chuckles from his gang. "Maybe you should think about having breakfast at the retirement home instead." The other bikers, Snake, Rex, and their companions, would join in with their own comments, each one trying to outdo the other with their mockery. This particular Thursday morning was worse than usual. The bikers had pushed two tables together right next to Harold's booth, creating an unnecessary amount of noise. Their leather jackets squeaked against the vinyl seats as they sprawled across their chairs, taking up more space than they needed. "Hey, Gramps," called out Snake, a younger biker with a snake tattoo coiling around his neck. "Tell us another story about the good old days, when dinosaurs roamed the earth." The group erupted in laughter, high-fiving each other across the table. Linda, the cafe's owner, emerged from the kitchen when she heard the commotion. She was a strong-willed woman in her 60s who had inherited the cafe from her father. The worry lines on her face deepened as she observed the scene. She had known Harold for decades and considered him family, but she also knew that confronting the bikers could lead to more trouble. "More coffee, Harold?" Linda asked, approaching his table with a fresh pot. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes conveyed her concern. Harold nodded, managing a small smile despite the situation. As Linda poured his coffee, she noticed his hands were shaking more than usual. "Look at that trembling," Rex mockingly whispered to his friends, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can't even hold a cup steady anymore." The regular customers had started avoiding Thursday mornings altogether. Mrs. Peters now came on Wednesdays instead, and Mr. Johnson had switched to getting his coffee to go. The once warm atmosphere of the cafe had turned cold and tense, especially around Harold's corner. Even the smell of fresh-baked pies and brewing coffee couldn't mask the unpleasant atmosphere. The bikers ordered their food loudly, complained about everything, and left measly tips for Jenny, who continued to serve them with forced politeness. Harold sat quietly through it all, his military training evident in his composed demeanor. He focused on his breakfast, methodically cutting his eggs and sipping his coffee, trying to maintain his dignity despite the constant harassment. But those who knew him well could see the pain in his eyes, especially when the bikers made fun of his age or his difficulty moving around. One of the younger bikers, a new addition to the gang who called himself Razor, revved his motorcycle engine right outside Harold's window, causing the old veteran to flinch slightly. The group found this particularly amusing, making engine noises whenever Harold reached for his coffee cup. Linda watched from behind the counter, her hands gripping a dishcloth tightly. She had tried talking to Spike about his group's behavior, but he had simply laughed it off, saying they were just having some fun. The local police couldn't do anything either. The bikers were technically not breaking any laws. As the morning wore on, Harold finished his breakfast in silence, leaving his usual generous tip for Jenny. He grabbed his cane and stood up slowly, his joints stiff from sitting. As he made his way to the door, Spike stuck out his boot slightly, not enough to trip Harold, but enough to make him stumble slightly. "Watch your step, old-timer," Spike called out with false concern. "Wouldn't want you to break a hip." Harold paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something. The cafe grew quiet, waiting. But he simply pushed the door open and stepped out into the morning sun, leaving behind a group of laughing bikers who had no idea that their actions were about to lead to an unexpected turn of events. That evening, Harold sat in his small living room, surrounded by photographs and memories. His modest house on Oak Street held the stories of his life within its walls. As he settled into his favorite armchair, his eyes fell on a dusty photo album he hadn't opened in years. With careful hands, Harold pulled the heavy album onto his lap. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and the pages crackled as he opened them. The first photograph made his breath catch. There he was, standing proudly in front of Meyer's motorcycle repair in 1946, just after he returned from the war. The shop had been his pride and joy. Harold had built it from nothing, using the mechanical skills he learned maintaining military vehicles during World War II. His reputation for honest work and mechanical genius had spread across 3 counties. Motorcycles would arrive in pieces, and Harold would bring them back to life with skilled hands and patient attention. In another photograph, a beautiful woman with dark hair sat on a gleaming Harley-Davidson, her smile bright and fearless. Sarah, his wife, had loved motorcycles as much as he did. They would spend their Sundays riding through the countryside, the wind in their faces and the rumble of the engine beneath them. Harold's weathered fingers traced the outline of her face in the photograph. "We'd had some wonderful rides, didn't we, Sarah?" he whispered to the empty room. The next page held newspaper clippings from the 1950s and 60s. "Myers shop fixes 1,000th motorcycle," one headline proclaimed. Another showed Harold teaching a free maintenance class to local riders. He had believed in helping others, in sharing his knowledge with anyone who wanted to learn. But then Harold turned to the page he usually avoided. The newspaper clipping was yellowed with age. "Local couple in tragic motorcycle accident." The date was May 15, 1975. Harold and Sarah had been riding on a beautiful spring evening when a drunk driver swerved into their lane. Sarah was killed instantly. Harold survived but spent months in the hospital. After the accident, Harold couldn't bear to look at motorcycles anymore. He sold his beloved shop, gave away his tools, and tucked away all the photographs. The sound of motorcycle engines, once music to his ears, became a painful reminder of everything he had lost. The memories flooded back as Harold continued through the album. There were photos of him teaching young apprentices, of Sarah helping in the shop's office, of the Christmas parties they would throw for their customers. The motorcycle community had been their family. One particular image caught his eye, a group photo from 1970. Harold stood in the center, surrounded by a local motorcycle club. They were different from Spike and his gang. These riders respected their machines, respected each other, and most importantly, respected the knowledge of those who came before them. "Things were different then," Harold murmured, closing the album gently. He looked out his window at the setting sun, thinking about how the motorcycle world had changed, the craftsmanship, the brotherhood, the honor. It seemed like those values had faded away, replaced by the kind of behavior he now endured at Linda's cafe. On his workbench in the garage, covered in years of dust, sat his old toolbox. Harold hadn't opened it since the day he closed his shop. Inside were the specialized tools he had collected over decades, each one with its own story, each one a testament to his expertise. The evening grew darker, but Harold remained in his chair, lost in thoughts of chrome and steel, of Sunday rides and Sarah's laughter, of the respect he had earned through years of honest work. The harassment at the cafe stung not just because of the bikers' cruelty, but because they represented everything that had gone wrong with something he once loved so deeply. As Harold finally rose from his chair, using his cane for support, he glanced one last time at the photograph of his shop. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring inside him, not just the pain of loss, the spark of the passion that had once driven him. Tomorrow was Thursday, and as he prepared for bed, Harold began to form a plan that would shock everyone at Linda's Corner Cafe. Thursday morning arrived with dark clouds hanging over the town. Harold sat in his usual booth at Linda's Corner Cafe, but something was different about him today. His usual gentle expression had been replaced by a look of quiet determination. Jenny noticed it when she brought his coffee, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what had changed. The familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air right on schedule. Spike and his gang roared into the parking lot, their bikes unnecessarily loud in the quiet morning. Through the window, Harold watched them dismount their motorcycles, noting how carelessly they treated their machines. The bell above the door jangled violently as the bikers burst in. Today, they seemed particularly rowdy. Spike led his group straight to their usual spot next to Harold's booth, dragging chairs across the floor with a screech that made everyone wince. "Well, if it isn't our favorite old-timer," Spike announced, slapping his hand on Harold's table hard enough to make the coffee splash over the rim of the cup. "Still taking up the best seat in the house?" The other customers in the cafe held their breath, waiting for the usual scene to unfold. Jenny gripped her coffee pot tightly, while Linda watched anxiously from behind the counter. But Harold didn't respond. Instead, he calmly picked up his napkin and began wiping up the spilled coffee. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Lost your hearing aid?" Snake taunted, leaning close to Harold's ear. The gang burst into laughter, high-fiving each other across the tables. It was then that Razor, the youngest of the group, decided to show off. He pulled out his keys and deliberately dropped them into Harold's plate, sending eggs and toast flying onto the old veteran's lap. The cafe fell completely silent. Harold looked down at his ruined breakfast, then at his stained pants. Slowly, very slowly, he reached for his cane and pushed himself to his feet. Everyone expected him to leave, as he usually did when things got too rough. Even the bikers seemed surprised when he turned to face them. "Young man," Harold said quietly to Razor, his voice steady and clear, "would you mind moving your motorcycle? The red one with the modified exhaust?" Razor looked confused but smirked. "Why should I, old man? Scared it might keep you awake during your morning nap?" Harold's blue eyes, which had seen battlefields and survived loss, fixed on Razor with unexpected intensity. "Because in about 10 minutes, that front fork is going to fail completely. I can hear the stress in the metal from here. Wouldn't want you to get hurt." The smirk faded from Razor's face. Spike stood up, towering over Harold. "What are you talking about, old-timer?" Without another word, Harold turned and walked slowly toward the door. The bikers exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or follow. Curiosity won out, and they trailed behind him as he made his way to their motorcycles. Harold stopped beside Razor's bike. With movements that seemed to shed years from his frame, he lowered himself to examine the front fork. His fingers, though wrinkled, moved with surprising precision over the metal. "See here," he said, pointing to a spot that showed signs of stress. "And here? Poor welding job, probably done by someone who thought they knew more than they did." The other customers had gathered at the cafe windows, watching the scene unfold. Jenny and Linda stood in the doorway, worried but unable to look away. Harold straightened up, using his cane for support, and turned to face the group of now silent bikers. "You boys have been having your fun at my expense for weeks now," he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "But there's something you should know." He paused, looking each of them in the eye. "When you've spent as many years as I have working with motorcycles, you learn to recognize the sound of trouble. And right now, every single one of your bikes is screaming for help." The bikers stared at him, their tough facades cracking as they processed his words. Harold Myers, the old man they had been tormenting, was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. And you wouldn't need to raise his voice or throw a single punch to do it. The morning sun had fully risen over Linda's Corner Cafe as Harold moved from one motorcycle to the next, pointing out problems that even their owners hadn't noticed. The bikers huddled around him, their earlier mockery replaced by growing respect and concern. "Your carburetor's running, Rich," Harold said to Snake, gesturing at his chrome-covered bike. "That's why you're burning through fuel so fast. And these aftermarket parts you've added, they're knockoffs. Could fail at any moment." Snake's face paled as he realized how many miles he'd ridden with these issues. Moving to Rex's motorcycle, Harold ran his hand along the frame. "Whoever sold you this bike didn't tell you it had been in an accident, did they?" Rex shook his head, stunned. "The frame's been straightened, but not properly. See the subtle bend here?" Harold traced a nearly invisible line with his finger. "One bad bump at high speed, and you could be in serious trouble." The cafe's regular customers had drifted outside, forming a loose circle around the scene. They watched in amazement as Harold, who they'd only known as the quiet veteran who ate breakfast alone, transformed into something entirely different. His movements were sure and precise, his knowledge encyclopedic. Spike stood back, arms crossed, trying to maintain his tough image. But when Harold approached his prized motorcycle, even he couldn't hide his curiosity. "What about mine, old-timer?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual edge. Harold circled Spike's bike slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. "Beautiful machine," he said softly. "1985 FXSB lowrider, isn't it? They don't make them like this anymore." His hand hovered over the engine. "But you hear that slight ticking when it idles? Your timing chain is wearing out. Give it another month, and you'll be stranded on the side of the road." "How?" Spike started, then cleared his throat. "How do you know all this?" Linda stepped forward from the cafe doorway, holding a framed photograph she'd taken down from the wall. She handed it to Spike, who stared at the image of a young Harold standing proudly in front of Myers' motorcycle repair. For 30 years, Linda explained, Harold's shop was the most respected motorcycle repair business in 3 counties. People would drive hundreds of miles to have him work on their bikes. He could diagnose problems just by listening to an engine. The bikers gathered around the photograph, passing it from hand to hand. Their expressions shifted as they realized who they'd been tormenting all these weeks. Harold watched them, leaning on his cane, saying nothing. "But why?" Razor, the youngest, spoke up. "Why didn't you say something when we were being He couldn't finish the sentence, shame coloring his face. Harold's eyes grew distant. Because motorcycles were part of a life I thought I'd left behind. After I lost my wife in a motorcycle accident, I couldn't bear to be around them anymore. Closed my shop, packed away my tools. He paused, looking at the row of bikes, but listening to your machines in trouble these past weeks. Well, some things you never really forget. Spike stepped forward, removing his leather jacket. The morning sun revealed faded tattoos on his arms, among them an old military insignia. "Sir," he said, addressing Harold with genuine respect for the first time, "I served too. Different war, same brotherhood. We've been acting like fools, disrespecting not just a veteran, but a legend in the motorcycle world." The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado completely gone. Jenny appeared from the cafe, carrying fresh coffee for everyone. The morning had grown warmer, but no one moved to leave. "Those problems you mentioned," Spike continued, glancing at his beloved motorcycle, would you be willing to show us how to fix them?" Harold looked at the group of bikers, seeing past their tough exteriors to something familiar, the love of motorcycles that had once been such a big part of his life. For the first time in years, he felt the old passion stirring. A small smile crossed his weathered face. "Well," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a set of keys, "I might still have some tools in my garage, and it seems you boys could use a lesson in proper motorcycle maintenance." Harold's garage door creaked open for the first time in years, revealing a time capsule of his past life. The bikers gathered around as he flicked on the lights, illuminating walls lined with old tools and motorcycle parts. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but beneath it lay a lifetime of expertise waiting to be shared. "First things first," Harold said, making his way to an old workbench. He opened his toolbox, the hinges protesting after years of disuse. A good mechanic needs proper tools. He pulled out a set of wrenches, each one meticulously maintained despite decades of storage. Spike stepped forward, holding his bike's manual. "Sir, about my timing chain." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with his new role as student rather than intimidator. Harold nodded encouragingly, and soon the garage was filled with the sounds of work and learning. "Hand me that socket wrench," Harold instructed Razor, who now listened intently to every word. "See how the engine tells you what it needs? You just have to learn its language." His hands, though aged, moved with surprising skill as he demonstrated proper maintenance techniques. Snake and Rex worked on their bikes nearby, occasionally asking questions that Harold answered with patience. The old veteran found himself sharing not just repair tips, but stories from his years in the business. The bikers listened, fascinated by tales of vintage motorcycles and the golden age of American bikes. Back in '62, Harold recalled, helping Spike adjust his chain tension, a fellow rode in from California on a broken-down knucklehead. Hadn't maintained it properly for years. Took us 3 days to get it running right. When he left, that engine purred like a kitten. Jenny appeared at the garage door with sandwiches and coffee from the cafe. She couldn't hide her smile seeing the former troublemakers now hanging on Harold's every word. Linda came too, carrying the old photo album Harold had been looking through just days before. "Is that you?" Razor asked, pointing to a photograph of Harold racing a motorcycle in his younger days. "Man, you must have been something else." Harold chuckled. "We all were, in our own way. Motorcycles aren't just machines. They're stories, adventures, memories." His voice grew softer. "My wife Sarah and I, we traveled all over on our bikes. She could ride as well as any man, better than most." The garage grew quiet as Harold shared more about Sarah, about their adventures together, and about the accident that had ended it all. The bikers listened with newfound respect, understanding now why their previous behavior had been so hurtful. After Sarah died, Harold continued, wiping his hands on an old shop rag. "I thought closing the shop would help me forget, but being out here today, working on bikes again." He paused, looking around at the transformed group of riders. "Well, maybe it's time to remember instead." Spike stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Myers," he said formally, "we've been real idiots. But if you're willing, we'd like to make it right. Our club meets every Saturday. Would you consider coming by? Maybe teach us more about proper maintenance." The other bikers nodded eagerly. These weren't the same men who had terrorized the cafe just days ago. Working alongside Harold had changed something in them, awakened a respect for both the machines and the man who understood them so well. "Please call me Harold," he replied, a warm smile crossing his face. "And yes, I think I'd like that. These old hands still have a few tricks to share." As the afternoon sun began to set, the bikers prepared to leave, their motorcycles running smoother than they had in years. Each man shook Harold's hand, expressing genuine gratitude and respect. The transformation was complete, from tormentors to students, from troublemakers to friends. Linda and Jenny watched from the driveway as the motorcycles roared away, the sound now carrying a different meaning. Harold stood in his garage doorway, leaning on his cane, looking more alive than he had in years. "Will you be at breakfast tomorrow?" Jenny asked hopefully. Harold nodded, closing his toolbox with satisfaction. "Yes," he said, "I believe I will, and something tells me it's going to be a much more pleasant morning than usual." Linda's Corner Cafe buzzed with excitement on Thursday morning, but not because of trouble. Instead of the usual tension, the air was filled with the warm scent of coffee and friendly conversation. Harold sat in his usual booth, but he wasn't alone. Spike and his motorcycle club members were gathered around him, their leather jackets now worn with humility instead of intimidation. "So that's when I realized," Spike was saying, showing Harold a notebook filled with motorcycle maintenance schedules, "we'd been doing our oil changes all wrong for years. No wonder we were having so many problems." Jenny moved between the tables with a full coffee pot, smiling at the transformation she was witnessing. The bikers who had once made her job miserable now said please and thank you, leaving generous tips and treating her with respect. They had even helped her clean up after the breakfast rush last week. "Harold," Rex called from the end of the table, "would you come to our Veterans Day ride next month? We're escorting some World War II vets to the memorial ceremony, and well," he paused, looking slightly embarrassed, "it would be an honor to have you there." The old veteran's eyes sparkled with emotion. Over the past few weeks, he had become more than just their motorcycle mentor, he had become their friend. The club members had started picking him up for their Saturday meetings, making sure he had a comfortable chair in their clubhouse while he taught them about proper motorcycle care and shared stories from his years of experience. "Speaking of rides," Snake added, "we've been thinking. Our club needs a proper name. Something that reflects who we want to be, not who we were." He looked at Harold hopefully. "How would you feel about us calling ourselves the Myers Mechanics?" Harold nearly choked on his coffee. The other cafe patrons, who had gradually returned to their Thursday morning routines, turned to watch his response. Linda, standing nearby, wiped away a tear, remembering the proud sign that had once hung over Harold's shop. "I'd be honored," Harold said softly, "but only if you promise to live up to the name. Being a good mechanic means being a good person first. It means helping others, sharing knowledge, and respecting both the machines and the people who ride them." The bikers nodded solemnly. They had already started changing their ways. Last weekend, they had helped a stranded motorcyclist on the highway, using the skills Harold had taught them to get her bike running again. The week before that, they had organized a free basic maintenance clinic for new riders. Razor, who had become particularly close to Harold, pulled out his phone to show him something. "Look what I found in my grandpa's garage," he said excitedly. "It's an old Indian motorcycle from the 40s. Would you help me restore it?" Harold examined the photo carefully, memories flooding back of similar restorations he had done in his shop. "It'll take time," he said thoughtfully, "and a lot of work. But yes, I think we could bring it back to life together." The bell above the cafe door chimed as more club members arrived. They had started staggering their arrival times to avoid disturbing other customers, another small but significant change in their behavior. Each newcomer greeted Harold with genuine warmth and respect. Linda approached the table with a fresh pot of coffee. "Harold," she said with a smile, "I was thinking. That wall space behind the counter has been empty since we took down the old menu board. How would you feel about putting up some photographs from your shop days? Maybe inspire the next generation of mechanics." The suggestion brought murmurs of approval from the bikers. They had seen Harold's old photos and understood now what a legacy they represented. Some of them had even started bringing their children to meet Mr. Myers, the motorcycle wizard, as they called him. Harold looked around the cafe, at the friendly faces that had replaced sneers, at the genuine camaraderie that had grown from conflict, at the new chapter of his life that had opened when he least expected it. His eyes misted over slightly as he nodded to Linda. "Yes," he said, his voice strong and clear. "I think it's time to bring those memories back into the light. After all, every good mechanic knows that sometimes the best way to fix something is to help others learn from your experience." The morning of Harold's 94th birthday dawned bright and clear. As he approached Linda's Corner Cafe, he stopped in his tracks. The parking lot was filled with motorcycles, all perfectly maintained and gleaming in the sunlight. A large banner hung across the cafe's front window. "Happy Birthday, Harold." Inside, the cafe had been transformed. Every table was filled with members of the Myers mechanics, all wearing their new club patches that featured a wrench and the words knowledge, respect, service. Values Harold had taught them. Linda, Jenny, and the regular customers were there too, all part of the celebration. "Surprise!" they shouted as Harold entered, his eyes wide with amazement. The walls of the cafe were now decorated with restored photographs from his shop days, carefully framed and arranged to tell the story of his life's work. But there was something else waiting outside, something special. "Harold," Spike said, stepping forward with uncharacteristic nervousness, "we've been working on a secret project for the past month." He gestured toward the door. "Would you mind coming outside for a moment?" The crowd followed as Spike led Harold to the parking lot. There, in the center of a circle of bikes, stood a motorcycle that made Harold's heart skip a beat. It was a perfectly restored 1946 Harley-Davidson, exactly like the one he and Sarah used to ride together. "We found it in pretty rough shape," Razor explained, "but we fixed it up using everything you taught us. Every member of the club contributed something, time, parts, or skills they learned from you." He paused, emotion catching in his voice. "It's yours, Harold." Harold slowly circled the motorcycle, his hand trailing over the pristine chrome and paint. The restoration was perfect, down to the smallest detail. Even the color matched his old bike, Sarah's favorite shade of blue. "The seat's been modified," Snake pointed out proudly. "It's easier to mount now, and we've added some extra safety features. But we kept everything else original, just the way you like it." Tears welled in Harold's eyes as he noticed a small plaque mounted on the bike. It read, "In honor of Harold Myers, mechanic, mentor, friend, and in loving memory of Sarah Myers, who taught us that love rides on two wheels." The gathered crowd watched as Harold carefully sat on the motorcycle. He didn't start it. They all knew he wouldn't ride again, but sitting there, his hands on the familiar handlebars, years seemed to fall away from his face. "There's more," Linda announced, bringing out a large cake decorated with a motorcycle design. "But first, we have some news to share." Rex stepped forward, holding some papers. "The club has decided to start a scholarship program," he explained. "Every year, we'll help a young person learn motorcycle mechanics. It'll be called the Harold Myers Memorial Scholarship for Future Mechanics." "Memorial?" Harold raised an eyebrow, making everyone laugh. "I'm not gone yet." "That's why we added future to the name," Spike grinned. "We got a lot more to learn from you first." The celebration continued through the morning. Stories were shared, memories recalled, and plans made for future projects. The cafe buzzed with the sound of laughter and conversation, so different from the tense atmosphere of just a few months ago. As Harold sat in his usual booth, now surrounded by friends instead of tormentors, he looked at the photograph of his old shop hanging on the wall. Below it was a new picture. Harold teaching Razor how to adjust a carburetor, both of them smiling, united by their love of motorcycles. "You know," he said to Linda as she brought him a slice of birthday cake, "life has a funny way of coming full circle. I thought I'd left all this behind, but really, I was just waiting for the right moment to pass it on." Outside, the line of motorcycles gleamed in the sun, their engines silent but their presence speaking volumes about the change that had taken place. The Myers mechanics had transformed from a group of troublemakers into a brotherhood of riders who understood that respect, knowledge, and kindness were the true marks of strength. And at the center of it all sat Harold Myers, no longer the bullied veteran but a respected mentor, proving that it's never too late for new beginnings, and that sometimes the most remarkable actions are the ones that bring people together.